I bet you didn't know that there is one particular subject area on the SQE where students are performing exceptionally compared to how they're performing in the rest of the SQE questions. In other words, their prospects of getting that type of question right is significantly greater than how they're performing elsewhere across the SQE. If you'd like to know what topic that is and why, stay tuned for the next episode on SQETV.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQETV?
So, which is the area where students seem to be outperforming themselves compared to the other questions across the SQE? Well, it's on the SQE1 paper, and it's not one of the main topics that you would have thought of that is maybe a little bit of a softer touch than anything else. It's actually one of the pervasive subjects, in other words, stuff that crosses across all subjects of professional conduct and ethics. That seems to be a type of question where students are doing particularly well at. And we've managed to glean this from the SRA's annual report from 2022-2023. And I've got an extract of that report here that shows how students are doing on ethics and professional conduct questions. Just having a look at it here, I'm just reading here. If you look along the top line there, if you did FLK1, the first paper for SQE1 in January 2023, and you were a pass candidate, you had an 81.6% chance of getting ethics or professional conduct question right, compared to 65.2% if you passed for your non-ethics type of questions. And even the fail candidate in that same sit is performing exceptionally better at ethics and professional conduct questions. They're performing at 44.7% for non-ethics questions, but answering ethics-based questions 60% plus of the time correctly. And if you can see across the table here, the pattern is consistent across all of the SQE1 papers that are covered by this report, both on FLK1 and FLK2. And that really shows us that candidates do find professional conduct questions easier than others.
SQETV.
So does the fact that candidates are performing very well at professional conduct and ethics questions mean that we can take our eye off the ball a little bit and just cram a little bit of professional conduct in before we sit the exam? Well, I would say no. If you've got a greater chance of getting a particular question right, you need to be doubling down on the time and the investment you put in towards those type of questions, because you're going to get a better return. In other words, more chances of getting that question right. So actually, you need to be doing more work rather than less work on professional conduct, because you're likely to yield better results at the end of the day, according to the stats I've just shown you. Now, professional conduct is a subject that, having taught it for many years, that candidates do find hard to spot the technical or ethical issues from the fact pattern, because when you get onto SQE1 in particular, you'll be looking at a fact pattern that's set in the context of a business scenario or a property scenario or wills or dispute resolution scenario. And the professional conduct or ethical issues are often secondary and are often hidden within the fact pattern. And that's deliberate by the SRA, because of course nobody comes into your office as a client and says, "Hey Johnny, I'm not got a business deal to talk about today, no property deal, we're not going to talk about wills, but let's talk about conflicts of interest." And no client does that. You have to spot the professional conduct issue from the fact pattern, and therefore always have at the back of your mind when you're looking at MCQ questions for SQE1, but also the scenarios for SQE2, that there could be a conduct point in there.
SQETV.
Just before I share with you an extract of the SRA's SQE specification that deals with ethics and professional conduct, I thought I'd share with you a few reflections as to why I think so many candidates outperform themselves when it comes to ethics and professional conduct questions. And it's because I think most of the time it's common sense. Yes, it's really important to learn those underlying principles and the exceptions, as I've just said. But what's really important is you just apply the smell test. And if it smells a bit iffy, then it probably is. It's as simple as that. And then it's a question of learning to make sure you do the right thing. And if you're armed with understanding what these ethical principles are that you need to be employing, it's much easier to get to the right answer in a multiple choice question. And when it comes to SQE2, I think it's much easier to get to the right bit of advice to give the client in the context of the scenario that you might be presented with an ethical dilemma.
SQETV.
If you look at the solicitor's competence statement, it gives you a little bit more background in terms of what you need to know. So I'm just going to get that up now. And the first part of the statement of solicitor of competence says that you need to act honestly with integrity in accordance with the legal and regulatory requirements and the SRA's standards and regulations. And you can see all the bullet points here. I'm not going to repeat them, but these more or less summarise quite a lot of the SRA principles that we're now going to show. So this is the standard to which you are expected to behave in practice, and therefore it is the standard you're expected to display when answering SQE1 questions, but also when you are answering SQE2 questions as well.
SQETV.
So the SRA's principles, there's 7 of them. Let's just briefly run down them and give you a bit of commentary as we go through. Firstly, you act in a way that upholds the constitutional principle of the rule of law and the proper administration of justice. Well, if you don't comply with the rule of law, in other words, obey the law, then there isn't really hope for anyone else. You're an officer of the court, you're a member of the legal profession, you're obviously expected to comply with the law at all times. Principle 2 is very much linked to that you act in a way that upholds trust and confidence in the profession. So obviously not obeying the law is obviously going to bring the profession into disrepute, but it's more than that. Where there are moral, ethical dilemmas that might not break the criminal law, but would be improper and people would frown upon, the smell test. If it doesn't feel like the right thing, then it probably isn't, that sort of thing. You've got to comply with the code, and there's all sorts of directions within the code that would indicate that you're not complying with the code if you fail that smell test that I talked about earlier on. Thirdly, you act with independence. And that means you don't put your interests before that of your client. Fourthly, you act with honesty. Fifthly, you act with integrity. Those are both common sense, which is what I've said earlier. Common sense prevails really with the code of conduct. This is why I say the smell test, trust your instincts, tends to suggest to you whether you've got an ethical or professional conduct problem. 6, you act in a way that encourages equality, diversity and inclusion. This is really important that you understand that this doesn't just apply with you and your clients. It applies with you in the workplace, with your work colleagues. It applies with you and other stakeholders within the legal profession, like solicitors on the other side, members of the court staff, members of the land registry and Companies House and so on. So all stakeholders that you deal with, you need to be dealing with in an appropriate way that is inclusive and encourages equality, diversity, and where you have respect for all the other people you are dealing with. And finally, you act in the best interests of each of your clients. Again, common sense. This is more than just not acting in cases of conflict of interest. There are all sorts of situations where you might be asked to do something, and the question is, again, applying the smell test, am I able to be acting in the best interests of my client if I do this? Or should I say, no, I've got to do that instead. That's the only way I can comply with that obligation. And these principles are mandatory, but occasionally they do come into conflict with each other, which is where it gets quite interesting. And therefore, sometimes you have to go into the code to find out which of the courses of action will have to prevail.
SQETV.
Those are the SRA's principles. We're now going to show you how we're going to explore these in a bit more detail in the second part of this video. So here's a bit of a teaser. Let's have a look at the next slide here. And we're going to focus on principle 1 now, because in the next video, what we're going to do is to show you how you can map different parts of the code of conduct to one of the principles. And in fact, every aspect of the code of conduct for solicitors and the code of conduct for firms can be mapped to at least one, if not more, of the principles. So principle 1, remember, that was the one where you have to act in a way that upholds the constitutional principle of the rule of law and the proper administration of justice. Well, what we can map to that for one of the many parts of the code is the code of conduct for solicitors 1.4, not to mislead your clients, the court, or others. Obviously behaving honestly and with integrity comes with that, which is obviously 2 of the other principles as well. But it tells you in CCS, Code of Conduct for Solicitors 1.4, that you're not to be misleading your client, the court or others, and that will mean solicitors on the other side as well. So don't be pulling the wool from their eyes or misleading them or omitting things in the hope that they don't see them when, from an ethical point of view, you should be disclosing them. And I've got you an example scenario here, which will be showing a number of these scenarios in part 2 of this video to help you try and spot when there are ethical issues. Take a look at this scenario where you would be employing both Principle 1 and CCS 1.4. Your client has pleaded not guilty to a criminal charge and has consistently protested his innocence. He finished giving his evidence late yesterday afternoon in a private meeting room before court resumes the following morning. He asks you if you think he will get away with it. When you ask him what he meant, he confesses his guilt but instructs you to keep that to yourself. And this is a situation that does come up from time to time, where a client pleads not guilty all the way through and then at some stage might just drop their guard a little bit and say, well, do you know what? I'm guilty as sin, but can you get me off, sort of thing. If that is the scenario, remember you've got a primary overriding duty to the court as an officer of the court not to mislead them, and therefore CCS 1.4 comes into play. And of course, upholding the rule of law and the proper administration of justice would mean that you shouldn't be representing somebody's innocence if you know them to be guilty through their own admission. So that's the sort of thing that we are going to be sort of playing around with when we look at other examples that we can map to the principles of contents of the code.
SQETV.
So hopefully that whets your appetite for part 2 of this video. If you liked it, please do remember to subscribe to the channel and click the like button, because it helps to improve our rating as far as the YouTube algorithm goes. And as we always do, when we finish a video on SQETV, we now say it's time for the jingle.
If you wanna be solicitors, why don't you come and visit us at SQETV? SQETV.